which is started now. And I'm glad that I can pass the floor to the host for tonight, which is Lisa Pohl.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Lisa and I will be the host of today's event. I would first like to thank you all for being here. And as you all know, probably, the elections of the Dutch National Parliament will be held on the 17th of March. And there is an unprecedented number of political parties to choose from on the ballot. For the people that are less familiar with the Dutch political system, the Dutch elections take place on a basis of a list of system of proportional representation. And there are 150 members of parliament, which means that a government needs 76 votes to seats to form a majority. However, no single party has managed this so far, so therefore coalitions are being formed. And a coalition then serves for a term of 4 years or shorter if the government collapses, which is what happened last January. I will first now introduce our speakers to you and then we can get started. Our first speaker for today's event is Tom Teuns, an assistant professor of political theory and European politics at the Institute of Political Science in Leiden and associate researcher at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics at Sciences Po Paris. He obtained his bachelor in liberal arts and sciences at University College Maastricht and his master's in politics at the University of Oxford. He has worked on research projects on topics such as the right to vote and tensions between democratic ideals and EU policies. And moreover, he won a VENI, I'm not sure, grant for his project Protecting Democracy in Europe last year. And today he will discuss and compare the trend of increasing number of political parties and fragmentation from his expertise in political theory and European politics. And as our second speaker, we welcome Marcel Libers. In September 2020, he has been appointed Professor of Interdisciplinary Social Science, Relations Between Groups and Cultures. He has also worked as a Professor of Inclusion and Exclusion of Immigrants at Radboud University and the University of Groningen, and he worked as a researcher at the Netherlands Interdisciplinary Demographic Institute. Some of the topics that he has focused on include right-wing voting behavior and Euroscepticism. He also wrote articles on voting behavior of people with migrational backgrounds and the dynamics in the Dutch far-right electorate around the turn of the century. And tonight he will discuss the social structure and geographical aspect of political affiliations in the Netherlands. So this event promises to be very interesting. We will first listen to the lectures given by our speakers, and there will be a Q&A session afterwards where you can ask all your questions. And for now, I would like to give the floor to Tom Teuns. Would you like to share your screen, or I think you're...
No, I will just talk. I think that's...
Great, yeah.
So I didn't make a complicated PowerPoint because I didn't have the time, unfortunately. But I am going to take as leading questions that you already have in front of you. So in the promotional material which I was sent, there are several questions that are asked about the kind of core theme of the evening, how it comes about that there are so many parties, how this affects Dutch politics, whether there's a kind of demographic context for that, what new parties may be representing new groups of voters, and what I think the effect of this fragmentation is on future politics. I'm going to use those as kind of leading questions for my presentation. I'd like to start though by really thanking you for the invitation. I think it's pretty amazing that after Zooming all day with your political science lecturers and your various other obligations, that you nevertheless would want to continue to Zoom on in the evening to discuss more about politics. It must mean that like me, you're all politics nerds as well as students of politics. And it's really as a nerd that I'm going to be speaking to, or as a geek, rather than strictly speaking as a scientist, as an academic. And that's because of the kind of research I do. So I don't know a great deal about Dutch politics when it comes to empirical political science research, right? So I don't do surveys of the Dutch population. I'm not an expert of a particular Dutch party. I don't do a great deal of statistical analysis of different vote shares. So my knowledge of Dutch politics is that of a nerd, that of a geek. Right? I follow Dutch politics. I enjoy it. I find it very interesting. My political science expertise is rather in the domain of European politics and in the domain of political theory. So I will be trying to answer some of these questions that were posed in the promotional material with respect to other trends in European politics that might be interestingly similar or different from what's going on in the Netherlands. And I'll be looking also at giving you some ideas about the more political theoretical kind of analysis that we can have of the situation. Right, so both the kind of normative analysis, what does this mean for democracy in the Netherlands? What are the pitfalls of this kind of situation? But also perhaps what are the upsides? And those are the sorts of things that my more empirically minded colleagues often shy away from doing. Right, so they often have very precise methodologies that lead them to very astute and accurate understanding of the facts, far more than I, but then unwilling to engage this more normative reflection, which I will welcome. I should also say that my children are sleeping next door, so I'm going to try to do all of this with boundless enthusiasm, but also to keep things a little bit on the down low in order not to wake them up. Okay, so moving on, and please, could someone give me a little sign when I have 5 minutes left? That would be maybe even 10 and 5 minutes would be useful, so 10 and 5. Just so that I keep track of myself. All right, so how does it come about that there are 37 parties in this month's general election? Well, the kind of stupid answer would be just that there are 37 parties who have presented themselves to be elected, right? Now that stupid answer tells us something though. It tells us indeed that in the Netherlands, the threshold for presenting yourself for election in the general elections is rather low, right? So some countries, they make the threshold for even presenting oneself in an election much higher, right? You might need a certain number of supporting votes to be listed. You might need to, for example, give a large sum of money, which is held in bond until the election passes, to see if you have enough votes to get this, to recoup this kind of fee, as measures to try to limit the number of parties that are being presented. Right, so there are all sorts of things that you can do to limit the number of parties that are being presented, and the Netherlands does very few of those things. It actually makes it rather easy for parties to present themselves in the general election. Right? It's not unique in that. There are other systems which are equally easy. But that's one of the reasons why there are many parties. It's a fairly simple reason. Of course, that doesn't tell us why there are more parties now than there were in the past. Right? That doesn't tell us why there is this effect, which in the promotional material and elsewhere is referred to as the fragmentation of Dutch politics. So for that, we'll need to dig a little bit deeper. But I think it is important to recognize that the boundaries, that the thresholds for presenting yourself in the Netherlands are rather low. Another reason why there are many parties is a general, and I think I would put this in a kind of European and even potentially a global context. There's a general move towards a fragmentation of politics. And by that, I mean not a huge number of parties like necessarily is the case in the Netherlands, but I mean that traditional center, left of center, right of center, center liberal parties used to have a much larger share of parliaments kind of across Europe and in many other places as well. And more recently, that share, the share of those kind of centrist parties, so in the Netherlands we'll be talking about perhaps the VVD, the CDA, D66 potentially, and Labour, PvdA, right? The share of those parties as a proportion of the total parliament used to be much higher than it is now, right? So these centrist parties and their cognates in different countries are losing popularity relative to other parties. Now that's not the case when we look at electoral results in every system, right? Let's take the American system, which is fresh on our mind from the from the changeover of the presidency in the US. There, the share of Congress men and women who are from the Democratic and Republican parties remains the same, right? It's basically total. You have some independents who caucus with one or the other, but basically every member of Congress in the US is a member of one party or the other, largely. That masks, though, a shift away from this centrist thinking in US politics, right? So it used to be the case, if we go back to, let's say, Clinton, the Bushes, it used to be the case that things were fairly, within my living memory, things were fairly concentrated around the center. Right? Ideological differences between Bill Clinton and George Bush were not enormous. If you contrast that with the ideological differences between certain of the nominees, for example, which were running against Donald Trump, so not necessarily the eventual winner of the election, but let's say Sanders, right, Bernie Sanders. If you contrast his ideological position with that of Donald Trump, we have vast differences in ideology, right? So we have a fragmentation that is kind of won over, kind of captured within this two-party system. And the reason for that is that US politics are designed, or has a feature of their design, this drive towards a two-party state. Right? The same is true in the UK. You have some minor parties, some regional parties, right? The Liberal Democrats, for example, manage in certain regions to have some representation. You have national, right, regional or national parties that have a geographic focus, which enable them to get into the British Parliament in London. So you have Plaid Cymru for Wales. You have the Scottish National Party getting seats from Scotland. But basically, it's a two-party system between the Tories and Labour, right? And that nevertheless masks, again, the story is exactly the same. There's an increasing diversity of ideologies represented in those parties, between the kind of hard Brexiteers on the right wing of the Tories, so what's sometimes called a one nation Tory, right, on the center of this conservative scale, and then going on the other side, people like Starmer, who's now the leader of the Labour Party, compared to Jeremy Corbyn before him. So you have actually the same phenomena. It's just being masked by the electoral system. So one perhaps important conclusion from that is a reason to go back to the central question, why there are so many parties in the Dutch Parliament, is because of the combination of a general ideological differentiation between different options and a feature of Dutch politics, which is strict proportionality, which is fairly low thresholds for being registered as a party, and that results in there being quite a large number presenting themselves, and an increasing number, right? We now have a reason which gives us also a trend. We have a reason which is associated with this more European and more global trend of this increasing diversity of electoral offering. And the next question that came up in the email was, what is the effect of this on Dutch politics? And I think here, actually, we can be rather modest. The effect isn't that big. Right? We have 37 parties presenting themselves, but likely only 15 or so will get seats. And of those 15 or so that may get seats, a decent chunk will get a rather small number of seats, right? So 15 is let's say, an upper-ish bound. There are certain parties who will almost definitely get a small number of seats. Parties like Denk, the Turkish-led faction, which broke off from the Labour Party a few years ago, will almost certainly get 2 or 3 seats. The SGP, the kind of very conservative Christian party, will very likely get 2 or 3 seats, as it always does. But then there are other parties which may or may not get a seat, right? They may or may not get a seat, for example. Volt may or may not get a seat. So, you know, the total number of parties that will actually be represented is up to us to decide collectively as citizens, but will unlikely be much larger than 15, if even 15. So that means that there's more than half of these parties that are in this running and in this race just won't get through. Now, they could nevertheless have an impact. It could be the case, hypothetically, that all of these parties presenting themselves has some kind of big impact on the other parties, on, let's say, one of the bigger parties, the PVV or the Labour Party, PvdA or VVD or whatever, right? And I just don't think that's the case. My kind of reading of this is that largely the parties are fighting amongst big parties or amongst bigger parties, right? Even the targets of the smaller parties are to differentiate themselves from larger party platforms and to make a profile for themselves by kind of making clear points against others. So if you take, for example, Ja 1, the small split-off party from the Forum for Democratie, right? They're profiling themselves as the real voice of Forum, right? Against these scandalous developments from their perspective of what happened with ballot so recently, November and December. If you look at Bij 1, it's about profiling, on the one hand, really making clear what the kind of distinctions are between their platform and their closest ideological competitors, so the Socialist Party, SP, and GroenLinks, and also targeting the larger parties, VVD, etc. None of these parties are really talking about the parties which are polling at very low or even rather insignificant numbers. And similarly, if you look at the larger parties, they don't spend a lot of time responding to these smaller parties in the polls. PvdA, if you look at the recent interview, today's interview by Ploemen in nu.nl, for example, but also her recent responses on Twitter, it's really targeted towards the VVD, it's really targeted towards the government parties, the D66, right? She's not engaging the questions of potential collaboration or ideological difference between the Labour Party and Bij 1 or whatever, right? It's just kind of off the agenda. And the reasons for that are quite strategic and quite simple. There's no upside to targeting people who are unlikely to get enough seats to get into office. Yeah. I think, nevertheless, the phenomena of fragmentation in Dutch politics does have an effect. So the kind of headline story of 37 parties, that's not doing so much compared to the 15 or the 18 parties maximum that might be viable. What is having an effect is fragmentation in the sense that we need, rather often in Dutch electoral politics, we need 4 or potentially even more parties to form a government. And that's quite a big deal. And that's quite a big deal for different reasons. That's quite a big deal because it's complicated, right? It's complicated to get a lot of parties to agree to a common governance platform. It's also complicated because it complicates the relationship of voters to government, because the resulting government will be a compromise government between a larger number of different ideological positions. And it's harder to it's both harder to keep that kind of government to account electorally and democratically, because there are lots of moving parts and there are lots of people involved. And it's also hard to explain and to communicate to the population what the kind of link is between their vote for party X and the resulting government, right? Because it could be that a rather minor party has ministers. Take the ChristenUnie, for example, who now has ministers and is in government. Oh, well, we don't have a government, but you know what I mean. Whereas they're a fairly minor party in Dutch politics. Right, so that's also a complicating factor. And that leads us slowly to ask the kind of normative questions that I'm particularly interested in. Like, what is is this a good or a bad thing? What is the effect on Dutch democracy? And here we have a balance. So the traditional answer is that proportional representation is a trade-off between accountability and higher representation, right? So a more accurate representation. Proportional representation means if you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats. That's great for groups of people who find themselves in groups of 10 or 15%, right? Because it means you get representation. Whereas if you're in a first past the post system like in the UK, unless you're very geographically clustered, it's unlikely that you'd get any representation. My colleague in the Institute of Political Science, Simon Otjes, brings out a very funny map every election with what the Dutch Parliament would look like if the Dutch were having these results with the British parliamentary system. I think for the 2017 elections, the VVD would have won 109 out of the 150 seats, right? We're talking about vastly different results. Now, of course, it's a fantasy world because people would not vote the way they vote if we had that system. In fact, we wouldn't have so many parties, etc. We talked about this earlier. But nevertheless, it's an interesting kind of reflection. Lost my train of thought for a second. Oh yeah, so the normative trade-off is usually presented as between accountability. So more direct accountability is lost, and as an exchange for that, you get higher representation. I always have wondered if it's a convincing argument, that classical portrayal. Now, the reason for that is that the sort of accountability that is gained through this broad brush, first past the post, two-party kind of system as an ideal type. There are also variations on theme. The kind of accountability I don't think is necessarily that much clearer and more useful democratically than the alternative, right? And the reason for that, perhaps we can also draw, the reason for my skepticism as to this, how convincing this classical argument is, can also be drawn a little bit from my introductory remarks. So these systems, to some extent, they shape politics, but to a large extent, they hide politics, right? So we have lots of variation now in, let's say, the British Labour Party or in the British Conservative Party, much more than there was 20 years ago. And it's the same in the US. We have much more ideological diversity in the Democratic and Republican parties than we had 25 years ago. Right? So saying that because there's one party in government now that has the trifecta, right, has a majority in all three branches, not branches, but in the Senate, in the House of Congress, and the presidency. For me, that masks, in fact, a more interesting and a closer look at the levers of power, right? If certain policy is being made in the United States, it's because certain particular people are pushing through particular agendas. And when that happens in a particular party, say the Democratic Party pushes a particular agenda, its leadership does, that will always come at the cost of other voices within that party, right? So holding the party generally accountable for the actions of particular people in that party is, I think, not super interesting. If we think about what we might want to do as voters in response to, let's say, bad policy, what we consider bad policy, we might want to hold to account electorally the decision makers. But in the US, that might mean, let's say, I'm someone on the left, I don't hide that. If I was unhappy with Biden's policy because I considered it too centrist, it just seems a pretty brutish conclusion to say, okay, well, then I can vote for the Republican Party, right? What really is a conclusion I would need to draw is that perhaps I need to push for challengers to incumbents who are supporting this centrist New Labour type politics, right? So I might support candidates to challenge in primaries, to challenge these incumbents for their Congress seats or for their governor seats or whatever, right? And so accountability has to become more complex even when the system seems to paper over complexity. So in that sense, I think a greater level of representation, so a more accurate representation, is overall a good thing. Now, that doesn't mean that fragmentation itself is a good thing, right? It might be the case, and I think it is the case, that too much fragmentation, too much heterogeneity in a country, and especially where the fragmentation that there is and the diversity that there is becomes more extreme, we call that polarization, that's actually a bad thing for democracy, right? As a Democrat, I'm quite happy when there are 5, 10, 12 different parties representing, let's say, different corners of the electoral perspective, right? If we have a left-right axis and a progressive conservative axis, I quite like that there's, let's say, 9 parties where you can vote for a left progressive or a left centrist or a left conservative. You know what I mean, right? Or you can vote for a right-wing conservative or a right-wing progressive, and that you have that choice. That's a good thing for me as a Democrat. But what's bad is that if those 9 ideal positions that we sketched out on this x-axis keep drifting apart further and further, where at some point these positions perhaps become so far removed from one another that a healthy relationship of candidates to one another, where they recognize one another as being legitimate, right, being legitimately in the opposition or being legitimately in government, that starts to come under strain. Okay, how much time do I have left? Can someone give me a little indication of that? Because I'm not watching that at all.
Yes, around 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, great. So I've gone quite quickly. Let's recap that for a second, since I have the time. So we've talked about why fragmentation is happening, the kind of systemic reasons for why fragmentation is happening in the Netherlands, so the kind of formal reasons, the reasons that are due to the system of how politics works in the Netherlands, but also more generally, we've been talking about fragmentation in European and global politics. And we've been talking about how having a greater ideological divergence between different parties, or having a clear ideological divergence between different parties, in fact helps, from my perspective, helps democracy. Let's put a little bit of pressure on that idea, because in the introduction, one suggestion which was kind of made implicitly is that it kind of makes things difficult for us, right? Because as citizens, we need to choose. I think that's true to a certain extent. So what's not that useful for politics, democratic politics, is the competition of multiple parties along the same ideological space, right? Especially where in a system like the Netherlands, it's possible that over competing in the same space actually reduces the number of seats of the voters of that space. Let me take you through a thought. If we have a number of parties that are clustered ideologically, let's say P van de A, Denk, on certain issues are 50 plus, whatever. We have a bunch of parties clustered in a similar ideological space, but let's take some of these low-ranking parties that get too few votes to get a seat as well, and put them in the same ideological space. Like if we have too many small competing parties which are winning not enough votes to get seats, we basically have a lot of wasted votes, right? We have a lot of people voting for parties that don't get representation, which means we have a lot of people that are not being represented in Parliament. And that perhaps is a downside. I'm speaking purely from the perspective of being a Democrat, right? We're not talking about substantive politics. We're not talking about me being a lefty and being happy when left parties are well represented. We're talking about, as a Democrat, me thinking that it's important that people are able to choose and to choose freely. Now, there's also a concurrent, perhaps more important reason, right? This idea about wasted votes is still a rather minor idea, because the vote distribution is such that most of the votes actually go to some big parties and few votes go to these splinter parties, as we've discussed. Right? There's another reason though, which is kind of keeping citizens informed about politics, and I think that was the context in which was alluded to in the introduction. If there are lots of viable parties competing at the election, it's hard as voters to get informed. We see an impact of this. We see a direct impact of this in the recent TV debate, right? So it was a big fuss that the Labour Party was not invited to the main TV debate because of the formula that was used. The formula that was used was weighed on the number of seats in the previous parliament plus polling, and the Labour Party just didn't meet the threshold. Whereas, you know, the Labour Party is, despite fluctuations, like other parties in that kind of space, like B66, who also fluctuates quite considerably, it nevertheless, we can expect it to continue to be an important force in Dutch politics. So it's not that great that they weren't able to debate on TV, right? Just as it wouldn't be that great if another, right? I'm saying this not as a lefty. It would be the same argument if it was the PVV that just failed to make that, even though they've been well represented in Parliament for many years now. That's of course symptomatic of this this difficulty in giving enough attention to the different parties that are presenting. Right? If there are too many parties that are viable, it's really hard to hold a TV debate with 12 or 15 parties. Right, so we have to make this selection, but that selection in fact feeds that machine of pushing forward only certain positions of certain parties being floating to the top, not by any merit or by kind of ideological competition, but just because media attention is limited and it's difficult as a voter to focus on the variety, even the kind of feasible variety of options that were presented to. So that might be a downside as well. And I think that's actually quite a sensible conclusion we can draw. So it is the case that one of the effects on Dutch politics is that it's in fact more difficult to be well informed about the election. Right? It's just straightforwardly more difficult to read all of the party platforms if there are more of them, right? And it's more difficult to as a citizen, even as a citizen who wishes to be informed about politics, to make therefore a kind of an independent and considered opinion, rather than going by things which we might want to matter less, like how much screen time someone gets on television, or their name recognition, or certain other kind of, whether you happen to be able to hitch on to a trending story or a kind of meme in the last weeks or something like this, right? These are things that we might want to have a less important or a less significant impact on elections. Right? We see in Dutch elections, I think largely as a result of the large number of parties that present themselves, and I'm talking actually here about the 15 rather than the 37, that it's rather common for there to be pretty big fluctuations in the polls in the last weeks. So in the 3 weeks of the campaign, let's say. There was an interesting post recently on this on our blog, Stuk Rood Vlees, which is one of the best Dutch political science blogs, on exactly that phenomenon, right? So this late stage fluctuations. I think that's perhaps also something which is working behind the scenes here. Okay, so are new parties really representing new demographics? I think that is the extent to which that's the case is limited. It's not entirely absent, but it's limited in the sense that I don't think that there are so many new demographics. I'll leave it to our second speaker to speak more about to that point precisely. But let's take, for example, Denk as an illustrative example, right? So Denk is a kind of thematically they're focused on issues of multiculturalism, of the places of minorities in Dutch politics. Ideologically, they position themselves fairly closely to the Dutch Labour Party, potentially with the exception of certain foreign policy issues regarding certain countries like Turkey and Morocco, countries where they have a lot of voters that are interested in those issues. Is it the case that these are new in Dutch politics? No, it's just the case that they're newly split off from the Labour Party, right? How is that a good or a bad thing? I think it's from a Democrat perspective, I think it's a largely neutral thing. It increases this ideological space, so there's these downsides that we discussed, but it's not. Let me put the point differently. Some people think it's good that we have what's called descriptive representation, right? That basically I have highly educated white heterosexual men representing me, and that other people have people who look like them and share certain features with them regarding their ethnicity or their religion or their sexuality, whatever, representing them. I'm not a partisan of that view, right? I think it's much more interesting to have a democratic politics which competes at the level of ideas than to have this descriptive representation. And if that, so I don't rejoice every time there's a new party which claims to represent a certain specific subgroup descriptively, because I don't think that that's where the interesting democratic politics comes from. It used to be the case in Dutch politics that descriptive representation was the name of the game, right? We have polarization of Dutch politics. So basically, if you're a Catholic, you voted for Catholic parties, you went to Catholic supermarkets, Catholic hairdressers, and spoke with Catholic people, right? I'm quite happy that that's not the case anymore, and that Catholics now can decide by reflection and civic discussion, etc., where they stand on issues substantively, and can vote for parties and do vote for parties based on those more ideological differences between them. So in that sense, I both don't think that there is a great increase in this element of descriptive representation, and where we seem to see that happening, I don't think it's something necessarily to be very thrilled about. Let me end then with the last question from the promotional email. What do I see as the effect of this on the future of Dutch politics? I think one immediate effect, there's several effects. One of the effects of fragmentation on Dutch politics, which is overlooked often or not discussed much, is that it makes the work of politics for these small parties difficult, right? If you have one or two members of parliament, it's actually pretty difficult to hold government to account. It's pretty difficult to just do your job, right? Now that should mean, in my opinion, that smaller parties in fact get more resources in parliament, right? Because it's important that they do their job. They have an electorate who voted for them. They are volksvertegenwoordigers, right? They are representatives of the people in the legislative sense. They embody our collective sovereignty. They co-legislate on our behalf, and it's important that they are able to do that well. But to keep abreast of all of the policy issues, on the work of all of the ministries in terms of their accountability, their account-keeping function, it's very difficult to do this when you have one person or two people. That's one effect which I think is overlooked. Another effect which is not overlooked, which is a lot of ink and space has been given, is a government formation, right? So if you have fewer bigger parties, and especially in the situation where some of those parties are considered to be extreme by other parties, right? So the PVV is basically an outcast in terms of government formation for reasons which I find perfectly reasonable, just between you and me. Actually between the whole world, because this is being recorded. That means that there'll be more smaller parties that are part of government, and that is complicated. I've already mentioned, because it's not always obvious why a small party ought to be in government, right? Given that they got a small amount of votes, there's this kind of link between election results and government formation, which is weird. That's also the case for large parties, right? So if a large party hands over 20% of their seats, or even 50% of their seats, but remains significantly large to be able to make a majority with their ideological kind of neighbors on the spectrum, it's also a strange kind of circumstance that they end up in government with ministers, etc. So there's that effect. That means government formations tend to take time. I think this year will be an exception to that. The reason being the kind of pandemic, the corona crisis, will, I expect, although time may prove that I'm wrong, will push parties to form a government quite quickly. But in the future, over time, the norm will be increasingly, if we continue to see this fragmentation, the norm will continue to be long periods of government formation, right, of coalition building. Another effect, if this fragmentation continues, is the possibility of the polarization of politics. Right, so a fragmentation is both a cause and an effect. It's largely an effect, I would say, but it's also a cause. And if we have more and more parties competing in a small media landscape for voters' attention, right? One easy way to get voters' attention is through fairly aggressive soundbite, Twitter easy. I love Twitter. I'm on Twitter all the time, but like that kind of way of doing politics is not the most dignified, nor the most intellectually stimulating. It's not the one that leads the best to compromise and to deliberation, right? So increased fragmentation, because of the kind of promotional difficulties of putting yourself out there as a small party and gaining enough attention to continue to exist. They are, I think, potentially drivers for polarization in the longer term. Okay, I think I've covered all of the different questions. I'm really interested in your questions. I really don't want to go over time because I much prefer hearing you ask things that you're particularly interested in than just hearing my own voice on and on. And of course, our second speaker, who I'm very much looking forward to hearing from. All right.
Yes, thank you, Tom, for these interesting insights. We will get back to you during the Q&A session. And now I would like to welcome Mr. Libers to the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really a very exciting lecture, Tom, and you were sharing so many interesting thoughts, and I think they are really relevant for our discussion afterwards. And I think that some of these issues I will address as well during my presentation. I will cover some of these issues as well, but it's also good to see that we, I think, make a nice addition to each other, since I'm more an empirical sociologist working with surveys and statistics. That's also what I would like to do today, to show you something about the demographics of the voting behavior of the Dutch. And with that respect, I think it's also a nice add to what Tom mentioned and discussed, is that I'm next to my interest in the political fragmentation, I'm also in particular interested to what extent this mirrors the social fragmentation, and whether the social fragmentation we can really see well in the different political parties. And one of the examples that Tom gave is that we might see that the different parties, like the Labour Party, the PvdA in the Netherlands, with the 50-plus party, the elderly party, together with Denk, that they have quite a similar, more or less ideological profile, but they are very different in their demographic profile. And this might, of course, then show a strong fragmentation in society. And we have that more strongly when we say that all the elderly people, let's say everyone over 50 will vote for the party 50 plus, and everyone with an immigrant background will vote for an immigrant interest party. And we can, of course, see what kind of cleavages there are in society, what kind of social structures there are in society that are thought to be relevant, that they should be covered by political parties that work on their interests. Okay, I actually did prepare a PowerPoint presentation, so I will share that as well. So we have also a bit of a different style of presentation, and I will let me see. I can share my screen with you. Here it is. Yes. Well, I start here. Yeah. I have to make you a bit smaller. I just see all of you still in my screen, but I don't see my own presentation. Yeah. Okay. So I'm taking you along with some information about the demography and the Dutch political parties and voting for Dutch political parties. And well, in my own research, I've been focusing mostly on research on the radical right, on voting for radical right-wing parties. We can say parties with a nationalist ideology. And well, in the current political landscape, we can say those are in particular the Party for Freedom and the Forum for Democracy. Those are parties who focus on the role of nationalism and for parties that oppose immigration and European integration. And what is interesting in these parties, not only in the Netherlands, but like in most of the European countries where we have these parties, they focus on identity. So they focus on national identity. And I just give an example of the Flemish Interest Party. It says it is a Flemish nationalist party, implying that the cultural identity of our people are decisive for the creation and the government of the state. In France, we currently have the Rassemblement National. That is this logo, but in the past it was of course the Front National. And it said we have to defend the national identity, the French values and the French national traditions. And the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, it's not in the program currently, but it used to be in a previous program. It stated we love our own country, our culture, identity and traditions, therefore we put those first. And the interesting thing is that we see in the discussion in the politics and also in voting behavior that there seems to be a stronger role for the politics of identity and the role of identity. And not necessarily then it's referred to this kind of identity, but we can discuss whether also this kind of identity of national identity is captured when we discuss the role of identity that's increasing in the politics, in the role of politics of identity. And I just give one example, perhaps you read it from Francis Fukuyama, the book Identity, Contemporary Identity Politics and the Struggle for Recognition, that we see something going on in many of our countries in Europe, but also in the United States. And also Tom referred to that there is like a systematic change in those countries, that there is a political mobilization to promote the interests of a group that is oppressed or experiences of oppression related to this group identifying factor. And those can be like ethnic minority interests. Those can also be LGBTQ interests, or this can be women's interests. And there are different groups in society that experience that there is a kind of oppression, and they think that politics can be a vehicle to promote their interests. And if this is stronger recognized with this group, and there are more groups who recognize this kind of thing, this kind of oppression, and that there is a party needed to serve those interests, we can also expect a stronger fragmentation in society. And an interesting discussion in that with regard to identity politics is whether this role of nationalism and national identity is also related to this identity politics of oppression, because radical right parties and nationalist parties also claim that that these groups actually are currently oppressed and need their own parties to serve their interest, which is like one of the reasons also to explain the rise of the radical right. But on the other hand, we can say, well, perhaps social class is even like an identity politics, although it's not often related. You know, it's like we have, in the past, we had class voting, and currently we have identity politics. But perhaps even social classes who can, you know, perceive themselves to be suppressed and therefore search for a party that serves their interests. In a way, it's perhaps not that different than we had the voting in the past. If we look at those different interest groups who search for parties that serve their interests. Okay, for now, I was thinking, okay, probably we have many more parties now represented in parliament since the fragmentation is going on. But I wasn't really sure about this because I read a question that I received as well, so to reflect among the increase in the number of parties. And then it's also what Tom mentioned, okay, it's not only about how many parties are presented on the list, but also how many parties are in the end represented in parliament. And then I was actually surprised to see that in the Netherlands, we of course have a long history of many parties that are represented in parliament. And it was in 2017 that there were 14 parties elected to parliament, but it wasn't the maximum actually, although there was already a record with how many lists there were you can choose from, but it wasn't the case that in 2017 there was a record of how many numbers, how many parties there were in the end represented in parliament. This was already in the 1970s, in 71 and 72, the Netherlands had 15 parties in parliament already, and even in 1933 there were 14 parties in parliament. I mean, there is not necessarily a trend towards more parties being represented. Although if we follow the polls in the last weeks, we might expect that it will be 17 in this year, 2021, and that will be a record. But there is something else going on, and I think this was also mentioned by Tom, And that's perhaps even more relevant to see that fragmentation is going on, because the parties that actually are larger and take up a larger share, those decrease in what share they take up. And the number of seats for the largest parties is actually slowly decreasing from 1956 onwards, when the Dutch parliament increased its seats from 100 to 150. So that's why I start here in 1956. We see a decrease of the largest party, so that the winning party in parliament, from 50 to just over 30 seats that the Liberal Party from Mark Rutte had in 2017. So this is also like an indication that there is a kind of fragmentation going on, and that it's not only that there are more parties, but there are also it's also that the share of votes less concentrated. We have a few parties, and that's why I wanted to find out a bit more about the role of groups and the social groups in society, the demographics that are relevant for voting. And what I always do, actually, because I really love when I do the days after the elections to have a look in the newspapers online or on paper, and to see those maps and find out which party has become the largest party. And from that geographical patterns, we can really learn a lot, I think, because if it is true that demographics are really relevant for voting, we should also see that geographically, because we know, at least when you know a bit also about the geographical distribution of social groups in the Netherlands or wherever within a city, you can also say quite a lot already about the match between demographics and voting. So that's why I also would like to take you to the elections of 2017 and look on a very low level on the constituency level, to what extent people voted and what the largest party has became. And another thing is also what election research tells us on the role of different demographics, or we can say perhaps group identities, on voting behavior. So those are the two things I would like to show you. And I start then with a map of the 2017 elections. And I take them from the newspaper, and I actually have to stop sharing my screen because I go online and want to show you a bit of the differences in the outcomes in the 2017 elections. So I just stop sharing my screen and go to share a new screen. And let me see, I already, where is it? There's a PowerPoint. Oh, sorry, I just have to open again this one, it is, yeah. Share. Okay, this is you see that this is the screen, the map for the Netherlands, and you see what already Tom mentioned. There are many like these blue dots, which represent the Liberal VVD becoming the largest parties. And if we had a system like in the United Kingdom, the VVD would have like by far the most seats. But it's also interesting to have a look at what we find. So most of you, I think, live in Amsterdam. So if we take a closer look in Amsterdam, we see many green dots showing up, like every electoral district. And the lighter green dots means that the green left became the largest parties, and these darker green dots means that the D66, the social liberals, became the largest party. So in Amsterdam, in particular in the city center, it is either the green left or D66 that became the largest party. So if you have a closer look, for example, here at the university area, where I think perhaps many of you voted as well, it's the green left who took up 43% of the votes. I mean, the green left became the 5th largest party nationwide, but scored here 43% of the votes, and second, it was D66 with 27% of the votes. So it's almost 70% of the people voting for these two parties in this area, from which we can already derive that many students will vote for either of these two parties. It's either the students or the young people who vote for those parties. And it's not a pattern specific for Amsterdam, because if we zoom out again a bit, we see the same actually in Utrecht, and we see the same, for example, in Nijmegen, where in the city center, it's only D66 or green left, and also in Wageningen, but also in Utrecht, it's D66 or the green left who vote by majority. Now, if you start doing research and also read about voting behavior, and you start reading the classics, of course, then one of the major dimensions is the economic dimension for voting, isn't it? Like left and right. If you start, in research like 100 years ago, it's mostly the economic interests that are served by politics. We still see that today, in a way. We can say, if we, even though the Liberal Party has become in many constituencies the largest, it still does by far the best in the richer areas of the country. For example, if we go to one of the richest municipalities of the Netherlands, it's Wassenaar. We can see that the Liberal Party scores 60% of the votes, like in this one as well. It's over 60% of the votes in the Kiewiet school. 66% voted here for the Liberals in 2017. The same with which is here in Laren, another quite rich area in the Netherlands. We see that the Liberals score like a majority. It's 52% of the vote going to the Liberals. Okay, and if you think, okay, if those demographics on economics still play a role, we also need to find that in the poorer areas, it's well, probably the traditional socialists that score the best. So I would expect that if I would go to the northeast of Groningen or the far south of Limburg in Heerlen, which are the poorest municipalities in the Netherlands, that the Socialist Party would score the best there. So let's check whether we can find any evidence for that. Well, you already see some yellow dots showing here that's been the largest party, which is the Socialist Party. For example, if we go here, we see indeed that the Socialist Party became the largest in this area. Although in second place already the radical right here, the PVV, the Party for Freedom, scoring second. And this holds for all those dots here in Groningen. And then I go south, perhaps you can follow me. It's here to Limburg. In the Netherlands, we go to Heerlen, which is also one of the poorest cities in the Netherlands. And we see that, again, the Socialist Party scores in many of those districts the largest. But again, the radical right scores also second. And the radical right actually isn't known because of its economic program. It's not, the radical right is not seen as a very left-wing left-wing economic party, although it has elements from it. It's not necessarily linked to that. And sometimes it's also that it's not income that is linked to the radical right, but often it says, well, it's education. And if you go to one of the lowest educated cities or areas in the Netherlands, this is, for example, Rukven in Sint-Willibord here in the Netherlands. And then you would expect there as well that the radical right would do well. And this is indeed the case. Let me click that one. Yes, indeed. Here it's like almost 60% of the people who vote for the radical right. How completely opposite of Amsterdam area where you live. Let's see, here is green left. It's almost diminished to nothing, just like D66. So we have a complete different profile of the demographical of the people in this area, which have a very different demographical profile, and which can also explain the differences in voting for these different parties. And we know from earlier research that immigrants, Dutch people with an immigrant background, voted for the Labour Party in particular. And you all probably know that in 2017, well, it was the worst turnout for the Social Democrats in history. It was only in a few electoral districts still the largest. Among them, it was still in Amsterdam South East, in the Bijlmer area, where it was in a few of those districts still the largest, but it received their fierce competition from Bijeen. And in those national elections, Bijeen scored in a few districts also the highest score, like it was then still Article 1, it's now Bijeen, became the largest parties. Although it didn't receive a seat in the national elections, it did score the highest percentage in some of those districts in Amsterdam. And that's what also Tom referred to, that might be then just almost be perceived as a waste of votes because people voted for this party, but were not represented in the end in parliament. But yeah, here I think we see that.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think for the international audience, you have to explain what Article 1 represents.
Yeah. Article 1 was a new party in 2017. It actually was split. Tom just referred to DENK, was an immigrant interest party, and there was a kind of a conflict within this party. And then, Sylvana Simons, she started a new party, and it is Article 1. And she also, her main issue is that she addresses discrimination of people with an immigrant background in the Netherlands. And she herself has an, if I'm correct, an Surinamese background or an Italian background, I'm not really sure. But she mobilized many people with an Italian or a Surinamese background in these areas. And then, of course, we saw even within the immigrant community a division between, okay, who votes for this Article 1 or bijeen is expected for these elections, and the DENK Immigrant Party, which is mostly supported by Dutch with an Turkish or Moroccan background. And that's what we see as well, is a huge, I think, well, fragmentation in the outcome. If we go, for example, to The Hague, where these light blue dots are all the areas where the party DENK, so the Immigrant Party DENK, was scoring best. And for example, here it's DENK scores 50% of the votes, and it's in many of those areas where it really became largest. For example, here 60% of the people in this area voting for DENK, whereas it used to be really a Labour Party area. Yeah? It was a Labour Party. And what I think is interesting is to see, okay, how certain parties manage to keep different groups within their party, just like the elderly and people with an immigrant backgrounds and the workers and people working in public service, like the Labour Party used to do so in the past. And there is a kind of politics of identity, and that those different groups focus more on their identity with their related to their demographics than on their shared economic interests, which I think is one of the reasons also for the fragmentation in politics. Okay, now I have to stop sharing this screen again to go return to the PowerPoints. And that one is here again. Okay, so this is what I derive from the geographic. You can really see a match between who lives where and which party becomes largest. But I also like to see that more proof of that on an individual level. And just before we started, I mentioned that I also coordinating the national election survey for this year. And this is already running since the 1970s. So we have a lot of information of, okay, which parties are there and what kind of parties do people vote for? And do we see that the role of certain group characteristics like demographics become larger and more relevant over time? And which characteristics then do become more relevant over time? Okay, just see whether I can. Whoa. Yeah. So if I'm looking at relevant cleavages in society, traditionally we focus on conflict over material interest. And if you just had once an introduction in sociology, but also I think in political science, and then you return to the classics of Marx and Engels and say, well, there is this conflict between the capitalists and the workers, and that's one of the major conflicts in society, which is of course further developed by Dahrendorf, Mills, and Lipset, and who focus, okay, who actually represents the interests of the poorest and of the richest people in society. And political scientists and sociologists alike focus then on income and social class. Sometimes social class is a bit more difficult, and in particular, like if you do that in the Netherlands, and therefore the focus is more often on income. But I try to find out what the differences are on in vote choice based on income and on self-perceived social class. You can discuss whether that's the right measurement and whether it's the right way to look at it, to look at self-perceived social class, but I think it's informing after all. So I just show you like a figure. And well, there are not so many surprises that I will show you, but even like also in 2017, we see that there's a clear association that the poorest 30% of society are overrepresented among the Socialist Party, and the richest are overrepresented among the Liberals. And also the radical right is more likely to draw voters from the poorer strata as compared to the other parties. At the same time, it's not that it's like an complete divide, isn't it? So we still see quite a few people who are even belonging to the richest who vote for the socialist parties. So it's not that there is a full polarization in our society based on income linking to political preference. If we would have that, so if we would have, say, okay, in the Marxist approach, then we would expect that all the poorest people would vote for the Socialist Party, and none of the poorest would vote for the Liberal Party, which is not the case in the Netherlands. So we can say, well, there seems to be some role of income, but we might wonder whether it's very strong. And actually, I expected that income would have decreased. Since that there is an increase of parties which focus more on identity and less so on their economic dimension, I expected over time a decrease in the role of income. And I made a check because I just pulled all the data since 1971 and tried to find out, okay, what does income do in explaining the political preferences in the Netherlands since 1971? And I show you and I'm not going into detail of the statistics, but it's also not a perfect association that I show you, but it gives some indications of a trend. So it's like a disclaimer that is not a perfect method that I'm using here, but it gives an indication. So I just show you what the explanatory power is of income over time. And it's not really like a trend. I mean, it's larger in 1986 and 1989 than in the other years. It seems to decrease somewhat after that, but like in 2017, there is certainly a decrease. So it's not really, I really can't make like a trend out of this. Then I go to social class, and you see somewhat a similar pattern as with income. So self-perceived social class, we ask people to what extent do you consider yourself to belong to a certain class? And if people say, well, I consider myself to belong to the working class, they are much more likely to vote for the Socialist Party and for the radical right again, and much less likely to vote for the Social Liberals, D66, or the VVD. And we see here that it's particular D66 that is most likely to have people from the higher classes within its electorate. Yeah, a bit more. So it's a bit of difference between social class and income, but in a way it mirrors the findings. And also with respect to social class, I don't see a clear trend. There's been some kind of smaller effect in around 2002 and 2003, but not really like a pattern, as I would expect actually that there would be a clear decline of income and social class over time. But I didn't find any evidence for that in the Netherlands. But of course, we know from a social science theory that there is more than economic interest in society. There's not only economic stratification, but as Weber and Bourdieu mentioned, we also have cultural and social resources that define a hierarchy in a society. And therefore, we have to look at those cultural and social resources that people have. And most often, then education can be a predictor. Of course, we can have a high education that often comes along with higher income and also higher classes, but not necessarily. So there's no perfect relation. So it's good to have a look at what extent education also affects the voting behavior in the Netherlands. In particular, when we have so many parties, we can say, well, all the higher educated vote for the Green Left and for the Social Liberals, and all the lower educated vote for the Socialist Party and for the radical right in the Netherlands. Well, then we, of course, have a strong fragmentation in society with respect to the social groups and that are voting for specific parties. We find indeed the pattern, and you just contrast people with a higher vocational and university degree, which is HBO and university in the Netherlands, versus people with all other credentials. And we see indeed a clear pattern that the highest educated are overrepresented among D66 and the Green Left, and actually also among the Labour Party of today, which is interesting. So the Labour Party has an overrepresentation of the highest educated and not of the lowest educated, which it used to represent in the past. And we see the opposite with the Socialist Party and the PVV and Forum for Democracy, which we consider the radical right parties here. And But again, of course, not a perfect match. Also, among the radical right, there are people, 20% has a university of a higher vocational degree. And also among the D66, there is still well, at least 1/3 who doesn't have a higher vocational or university degree. So again, not a perfect match between education and vote in the Netherlands. And I expected an increase of the role of education over time in the voting behavior. But again, yeah, I really can't say that there is a clear increase, perhaps a bit unfortunate, but perhaps it's good that that's not the case. So perhaps we also like that our ideas are not always corroborated by the empirics. There is not a clear tendency of a stronger role of education over time. Okay, then there are other cleavages which perhaps then go back more explicitly to those politics of identity. One is age. You can say, okay, we have generational conflicts in society, and certain parties represent certain age groups in particular. I'm very interested what Volt will do, like Volt will do now in the current coming elections, and whether this then represents the youngest in particular in the electorate, and then will increase to the role of age in predicting voting. If we look at the age distribution among the parties, we already see those differences, and it struck me in particular, yeah, how bad the Labour Party succeeded in 2017 to attract people younger than 30. They hardly had, yeah, like at least in the survey, they hardly were found to attract this younger electorate, whereas the youngest were more likely to be found among the D66 and the Green Left electorates. Actually, also the Christian Union and the State Reformed Party had still a relatively young electorate as compared to other electorates. And you see that the traditional parties were also, Tom referred to, the Labour Party and the Christian Democratic Party have a relatively older people voting for them. So what is age doing over time? I would also expect that age would increase in its relevance over time. But this is really depending also on whether there is an elderly party competing in the elections. And the elderly parties haven't been that successful in the past, but it was in 1994, for example. It really made a landslide then. It was attracted many people voting for this party. And then again, of course, in this last decade. But we see here that in 1994, age really is an important predictor. And then it decreases when it's when it was a lot of conflicts, and then the party dissolved, and then it returned again. And in 2017, the age is making again a stronger impact on the voting behavior than in the years before. But not a clear trend that it's going up, and then so again, it's a bit depending on which parties also compete. And then I was, of course, curious about other cleavages in society that relate to this politics of identity. So what is the role of gender, for example? But then with gender, it's like interesting. We don't have like a party for women, a women's party. There was one I think, one on the list. I'm not sure whether it is this year, whether there's a women's party, but it never succeeded in getting any seats. So then you would already expect, okay, if there is not like a women's interest party in particular, then probably gender will not be that the main factor for people, or not the main factor affecting the voting preferences. We can perhaps even say that religiosity used to be always like one relevant aspect for people to vote, in particular in the past. And if we look back in history and see that there are so many parties in the 1970s and even before, those were really like the many different denominations that were represented by their own party. So the Reformed, the Re-Reformed, the Calvinists, the Catholics, all had their own party. And this was like, those parties all merged. Because like the merging question of parties, I think, is a very interesting one. And what Tom referred to, I mean, we have many parties that cover the same ideological area. And I guess that if this is the case and they're not really defined by a clear demographic, they will merge in the future. Just like the Green Left came from 4 parties. Yeah, there were 4 political parties that merged into the Green Left. The Christian Democrats, they originate from 3 parties. So they originated in the Christian Democrats. And this kind of merging will go on, I think, also in the future. Depending on what kind of also demographic is still relevant for the voting, either to split or to merge. So I'm still curious about gender, about religiosity, and of course about immigrant background, perhaps also like a sexual orientation. But then also we have those parties based on religiosity still in the Netherlands, and also on the immigrant interest parties, like for the coming elections, we've DENK, we've NIDA, we have in the Netherlands bijeen, different immigrant interest parties with a somewhat different ideological profile, but they all try to mobilize the immigrant vote. So I will just talk you through some findings of these differences, and then I will just wrap up and have some time for discussion. Okay, what do we find with gender? The gender differences are there, but perhaps not that large. But we do see actually what we mostly find is that on the one hand, it's the Green Left, which is its electorate is has a majority of women, whereas the radical right on the opposite has a majority of men voting for it. So there's always this gender divide on that axis. There's really this progressive conservative axis or the cosmopolitan nationalist axis, where we find that men are overrepresented among the nationalists and the more conservative, whereas women are overrepresented among the progressive and cosmopolitan electorates. But the differences are not that strong. And if we look at the trend over time, what I found here is that I think this was one of the few, well, from a perspective of to try to discover trends, we may say, well, 2017 is a bit unfortunate that it's not a little bit higher, the effect of gender, but there seems to be some kind of stronger effect over time of gender. So it seems to be that gender becomes more important over time, although it seems to be that in 2017 was much more, it had a stronger effect than the one in 2010. And I'm sorry I don't represent 2012 because we had elections then as well, but those were quite soon after each other, so I had to drop it here. Okay, then we go to a self-identified member of a religious denomination. And here we do, of course, see some major differences because we still have religious interest parties to say. We've got the Christian Democrats, we've got in the Netherlands the State Reformed Party, which is a very Christian conservative party, and we've got the Christian Union, which is also like a more conservative party, but has a more left-wing economic agenda. And we see that from the people who vote for this Christian Union and State Reform Party, well, over 90% self-identifies as belonging to a religious denomination. Actually, I expected here it would be 100%, but okay, there are still some people who don't identify to be religious who vote for those parties. And the same with the Christian Democrats, it's like 70% identifies as belonging to a religious denomination within these electorates, which is much lower for all the other parties. And in the Netherlands, we traditionally find that religiosity is much more important for the voting behavior than social class. For example, if we compare it to the United Kingdom, but this is the only reason for that is because we have really like Christian parties. Like Christian parties attract the Christian votes, whereas in the United Kingdom, it is mostly the conservatives that attract religious voters, but it's not the conservatives, it does not equal a religious party. So this is more mixed in the United Kingdom. And there is some kind of decrease over time in the role of religiosity in the voting, which is in particular starting as from 2003, there's a decline in being religious or not in voting outcome. But its effect is still quite strong, I have to say. Then one final difference is that, of course, with immigrant backgrounds, well, the share of people with an immigrant backgrounds is relatively small. And we find here, it says anders for the international audience is other, so other parties attracting the immigrant vote, but that is mainly DENK. DENK is there in this other category because it's very small. It's attracting the immigrant vote together with Green Left and D66, the social liberals, are most likely to attract the immigrant vote. I was surprised to see that also PVV and Forum attract a part of the people with an immigrant background, and it's like a non-European immigrant background, whereas the Christian parties hardly do so. If I see what the role of immigrant status is over time, I cannot really go back to the 1970s, because then they didn't ask where people came from, whether they originate from another country or whether their parents had an immigrant background. So this is only from the 1998 onwards, and well, you can not really see a pattern. There seems to be somewhat an increase, but then in 2017, when Denk participated, actually, we don't see this particular increase. And this is due because in 2010, people with an immigrant background in particular voted for the Labour Party. So it attracted very strong the immigrant vote, and then it scattered over other parties, also the Green Left and the D66 and Denk. So can we then for 2017 also see which cleavage is the strongest in affecting vote choice? And perhaps you're surprised, but in the Netherlands, if we look at what most strongly predicts, what cleavage most strongly predicts the voting, that's still religiosity. So religiosity has the strongest impact, because it is like those are somewhat larger parties, the Christian Democrats and the Christian Union, and they they manage to attract for a large part the people with who identify to be religious, and this makes like really the major difference with other parties. Whereas for income, education, and gender, which I thought to be much more relevant today, still are less relevant than social class and religiosity. And this is also, if you just take a look yourself at the map and look at, for example, which parties scored which districts the highest, it's really like the CDA, which score over 70% in some of the districts, and also the State Reformed Party and the Christian Union, which score in some of these electoral districts also over 70% of the vote, which also in a geographical analysis show you that religiosity is still also today like a major factor for the voting and the turnout in the Netherlands. Okay, I just leave it at that with that, and I'm looking forward to a discussion.
To open the floor to our public to ask their questions. If you would like to ask one or both of the speakers a question, please raise your hand in the Zoom program so we can give you a turn, and also please indicate to whom you're asking your question. Yes, Lydia.
Okay, well, I had one question to Tom, actually, first. You were talking about how small parties have limited effect on bigger parties, but then I was thinking about the PVV, because they started as pretty small, pretty one-side, one-issue party, and then they became actually a gedoogsteun party, and they had kind of a big influence, and now that it's unthinkable that they become a really small party again. So how does that fit with your theories?
Thanks, Leah. That's a great question. So basically, my thought about the effect of small parties on bigger parties is really a momental plan. All right. So at any given point in time, the bigger parties will tend to ignore the very small parties which are polling at 0 or close to 0 seats, 1 or 2 seats, right? That's not to say, of course, that you have no evolution over time of parties. Every big party started off as a small party, unless we have mergers and so forth, right? So of course, the radical right in the Netherlands, and more generally in Europe and the world, being the new kid on the block, they start somewhere, they start small, and then they become bigger. And once they're big, bigger parties take notice, right? So they were largely ignored when they were very small parties. Now, if we take France, for example, Marcel talks about Rassemblement National, right? They are the most important party in terms of French political discourse, right? It's all framed around who is going to face off with Rassemblement National in the next presidential elections, whether it's necessarily going to be, again, a Macron-Le Pen duo, or whether some other party can break through to the second round, right? So clearly this party has become extremely important in French politics. But it, up until, I'd say, her father broke through to a second round against Chirac, it was a party which was largely ignored in French national politics, right? So you have evolution over time, but small parties, while they are small, tend to be sidelined and ignored.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? Oh, yes, Bob.
Yeah, hello. I have a question for Marcel. I was wondering, I think we see that the same map in a lot of countries, apart from the Netherlands, that there is a big divide between cities and the rural areas, between progressive and conservative. And I sometimes hear the reasoning, well, it has to do with higher or lower education, but in the cities, you have also plenty of lower educated people. So why is this big divide between the rural areas and the cities? Is there any data on that?
Yes, thank you for this question. I think this is what you see on the maps is when you zoom in the cities that you see a strong division within the cities. And you see at most of the outskirts of the cities that there is strong support for the traditional either working class parties like the socialist parties or the new parties that represent these groups, the radical right, or the immigrant interest parties. So you see that very strongly in the different neighborhoods of the cities. And it's only in the city centers and actually where the higher educated are concentrated with the university areas where the parties that have the most cosmopolitan program score best. But since these have in general in these larger cities a relatively large share, for example, Utrecht is currently the on average highest educated city in the Netherlands, with over 50% of its population having a higher education degree. It has a strong weight, I think, in the turnout in these cities, and therefore it makes the contrast with the with the rural areas. So this is one thing has to do with education, and the other thing has to do with religiosity. So within these cities, we also see that there is a less the population is less religious. So I think that, well, although you doubt that education will do the thing, I think it is actually it is education together with religiosity that makes really the differences between the city centers, I have to say, and the rural areas.
I see that someone wants to say something.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I have data envy when Marcel's speaking, but I just wanted to give a slightly bigger perspective in the European context of the same kind of phenomena and even more globally, right? So one interesting thing when we're thinking about the Netherlands in the context of this specific question is that there isn't that much rural Netherlands, right? You have some areas which are lowly populated, but on the whole, the Netherlands is a very highly populated country. So the kind of distinctions in the Netherlands that map onto this rural-urban divide are not as clean as they do in countries where the rural areas tend to be poor and sparsely populated. Right? Basically, let me make that point with using the language of a new book by Thomas Piketty, the Capital and Ideology book. So Thomas Piketty talks about what he calls the Brahmin left and the merchant right. Yeah, so the Brahmin left is the idea that on the whole left-wing voters are more educated now, and that didn't used to be the case. And the merchant right is the idea that right-wing voters tend to be wealthier. Now, Marcel has given us much more fine-grained information about the Netherlands in the context of these sorts of questions. But what I wanted to say in the context of this rural-urban question is that whereas in a country where with real agricultural kind of urban rural areas which are very poorly populated and generally rather poor, this distinction will play out with both the Brahmin left and the merchant right being in urban areas relative in that scope to the rest of the population, the rural population. In the Netherlands, it's much less the case. So in the Netherlands, this pattern that you see of highly educated city center dwellers focusing in the city centers of Amsterdam and other cities. That's really the Brahmin left, right? That's this population that Piketty calls the Brahmin left. Whereas the merchant right cluster in what in many countries would be called suburban areas, but in the Netherlands are called villages, like Wassenaar and other areas, right? Some people would even say that's a rural area with the Dutch perspective. But really, if we look kind of as a geographer, being a 15-minute bike ride from the center of a big city is not a rural area, right? Just to add that.
Yes, Lydia.
Yeah, so from both of your stories, I kind of missed one trend that I think is also causing a lot of splinter parties. And you think about they have the same ideology, but it kind of exists because of fighting inside of the party. So there's a lot of shouting, the politics get tougher, the people get tougher, the discussions get tougher, like less civilized. And then you have, like, for example, Henk Krol that goes to 50, now he has his own party again. You have Thierry Baudet and that fight, and then you get Ja 21. And it's not because I think there's lack of ideology that there needs to be a new party. It's just individual people that are fighting. And then you get all these new parties. So I was wondering how you feel if this is a trend or something in Dutch politics or European politics, and how this affects this whole 37 party community that we have here.
Yeah, perhaps I can just start responding to that. I think that's a very relevant issue. And I think this is a pattern that we don't see only in the Netherlands, but in many other countries, and that there are splits. And this happens, I think, very often with newer parties. And in newer parties that there are some conflicts within those parties, and that there are splits, and that they try to compete within the same ideological area. But I also would like to posit a hypothesis that if they don't actually address either a specific demographic group, so the group that's split off, or that they really can differentiate in ideological terms, that they won't have that they won't last long. And I think that that will be only one election, and then they either will be merged again or this party will dissolve. So I think that splits among the newer party families is something that we see more often in European countries. But I don't think that those parties then will last if they don't capture other demographics.
Yeah, so I fully agree, as I would be wise to, with the expert on demographics. Let me give you an illustration, right? Who still talks about Rita Verdonk? She had more than 600,000 voorkeurstemmen when she was number 2 for the Liberal Party. Split off and became very rapidly yesterday's story, and that is just an illustrative example of that trend, right? You'll have parties which manage, because of the kind of identity politics type appeals, to stay on the scene for a longer time. I think Marcel perhaps would agree that the Denk is likely to stick around if they manage to continue to speak to this community. But where the splits are really about personalities, either they take over, right? They actually succeed and they take over the party which they split from, which is rare, or they'll disappear. That's the longer term perspective.
So like for this election, you could say, for example, yeah, 21 is probably not gonna last because they're not differentiating enough from either PVV or Forum for Democracy. So you would expect them not to get a seat or one round and not return next time.
Exactly. That's what that would be my hypothesis. That's we now have PVV, Forum for Democracy, Code Oranje as well, and yeah, 21. I think they somehow attract a kind of same profile of the electorate, and I think they will have really a difficulty to be represented in the next elections again.
I don't think it's impossible given how spectacular the Forum meltdown was at the end of last year. I don't think it's impossible that, for example, well, given the amount of support that has split away from Forum in their institutional parties, so the number of senators that have split, the number of European parliamentarians that have split away from this group, I don't think it's entirely out of the question to think that one of those breakaway groups could become the dominant group. It's unlikely, but that's a possibility. The more likely possibility is that that they'll disappear. Yeah.
And then it's like, it's just funny because there's just like, for example, you have Joost Eertmans and he came from, I think, VVD, and then he went to Forum, and within the 4 years of election, he went from 2 different parties, and now he's the front runner for the 3rd party in 4 years. I just think like that seems very, very Dutch to me. Like, I don't think you would see anywhere else that there's one politician that has 3 parties in 4 years and then actually becomes the front runner for the 3rd one. Yeah. And how do you see this? Is this a trend? Are we going to see it in another 4 years? There, yeah, just yeah, I find it very interesting.
So what I opened with, right? So strict proportionality with low thresholds for representation mean that this sort of thing is possible in Dutch politics, where in many systems it's much more difficult. So we'll continue to see it occasionally. I think though the more, so while this kind of kooky behavior and unusual patterns and political CVs are interesting to us as people who are interested in politics, I think the bigger story is that they don't matter, or that they matter very little to Dutch governance, to global trends in Dutch politics, and I think that will also likely continue to be the case.
And perhaps I'd like to add that it seems to be really like related to the proportional representation systems, and it's not only in the Netherlands. If you look in, for example, Italy, how many parties come up and go there as well, and it's also like that leaders shift from one political party to the other. So I think it is more linked to when parties have a chance to get, with a relatively low threshold, a seat, or then need a low share of the voters to get a seat, that this is more likely to happen.
Okay, I think Birte, you can go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the presentations. It was also very interesting for a non-Dutch listener. I want to ask a question towards Tom. You mentioned that the trade-off for representation is, a lack of accountability. And I was wondering whether this is already like a major issue in Dutch politics overall.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I should say that more carefully. So what I wanted to say is that that's the classical thesis, right? The classical presentation is that proportional systems who have lots of parties and coalition governments and complicated cabinet formation, etc., that often what is said about them normatively, right, what the advantages are and disadvantages are of that, is that we lose in accountability, but we gain in representation. And what I wanted to say is that I think that story is maybe not entirely wrong, but normatively, yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons to worry about its coherence, because certain other electoral systems that present as two-party systems, largely, in fact, mask a lot of ideological diversity and accountability. Right? This was my example when I was talking about the Democratic Socialists in America holding Biden to account and potentially challenging centrist Democrats through primaries. That story was me trying to kind of flesh out this worry that I have that accountability processes in two-party states are not actually that straightforward and simple, which is kind of the ammunition that people who make this argument come with, this classical argument about the trade-off between representation and accountability. So I'm not so worried about that kind of trade-off, I guess is the take home, or at least not as worried as most. I don't want to say most people, because that makes a strong claim, but as this kind of classical position in political science.
Judith, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. I have a question for Tom as well, because you were talking about descriptive politics. And if I understood correctly, you said that for you, it's not that important that you can vote for someone that looks similar to you. But I was wondering why, and to what extent do you think that the people who represent us should look similar?
Yeah, this is a hot potato. And Marcel said a lot about this, right? In the context of parties capturing certain sub-electorates. So Denk and PvdA are looking like each other in terms of their ideological positioning, but not at all, or not as much in terms of which people vote for those parties, right? There we're getting into really normative political theory and democratic theory. My view is that so one of the things that is interesting about democracy normatively is that it allows ideological competition between different views. It allows us to deliberate between different kind of ideas about politics, different ideals in politics, and where we're voting largely because of our descriptive kind of identity politics type reasons, that actually masks some kind of interesting ideological and intellectual deliberation and competition and engagement that democratic politics ideally can present us with. And that was as much the case when we were in a very pillarized society in the Netherlands, where people who were Catholic voted for the Catholic Party, as it is when people who are Moroccan, second generation children of migrants living in certain suburbs or certain districts of The Hague, right? I just think that's not the most stimulating and interesting democratic kind of deliberation. Now, that's not to say that people are doing the wrong thing by voting for these parties, right? That would be a really kind of strong and to me very, very bizarre position to take as a democratic theorist. What I mean is that ideally we can move on from those distinctions, right? So the sorts of oppressions, the sorts of discriminations that are leading to certain parties being able to successfully profile to very specific closed demographics, that those discriminations, that we can collectively kind of address them, so that it's no longer the case that being a Moroccan migrant in a particular district of The Hague means that one feels very associated with a particular political program, right? And that those people are then in that way incorporated more into our more ideas-based political democratic community and deliberative forum as a nation. But of course, that's an ideal, right? We're talking about something that I would want to see happen, not something which is necessarily going to happen, right?
Yeah, okay, I understand. I think until we are at that point, I find it still important that sort of all citizens can recognize someone that looks similar as a representative.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so let me put it differently, right? So if these sorts of things were not a matter at all, we would expect the number of representatives in a parliament to just statistically map the number of a particular minority community, right? So if, for example, being Christian did not have any effect on which party you chose and whether you chose for a particular party, we just expect roughly an equal number of Christians to be in each party. Of course, that's not like a goal in itself, but it is a goal that certain minorities, especially when those minorities are oppressed, are represented in parliament, right? So I also completely understand when, in the context of discrimination, particular groups try to kind of try to focus their representative goals on a particular specific interest party in order to make sure that that voice is heard. But that means that their views on more general policy and governance issues are being papered over, right? Because they have to, or they feel that they have to focalize their electoral energy and their political energy into making sure that that particular aspect of their identity that they feel is threatened or discriminated is in fact addressed.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, taking into consideration the time, I would like to ask the sort of final overarching question to both Marcel and Tom, which is, what are your predictions for the result of the upcoming elections and the coalition?
That's a very challenging question and difficult to answer. Well, I do expect that that will end up with more parties in parliament than ever, so that we'll have that record set in these elections, returning from to the start of these for this meeting about fragmentation, and I also expect that. So if I'm doing the research after these elections, that will have a stronger social fragmentation based on some of these cleavages that I presented in these elections than we had in 2017. Yeah, and I think that the major change will be with the larger number of smaller parties, and that for the other parties, it will be quite similar as the result of 2017.
We actually in Leiden we did in the institute we did a little prediction amongst one another. So I have specific seat distribution that I've officially predicted, but I won't share that with you because it's kind of crystal ball gazing. What I think is, and I mean the polling is extremely interesting, but the large trend of polling really tells the same kind of story, right? So right now in Dutch politics, there's one big party, which is the VVD. There are 6 big-ish parties, the far right, the Christian Democrats, the Social Liberals, the Green Left Party, the Socialist Party, and the Labour Party. Then there are like 3 middle small parties, the Christian Union, the Animal Party, and Forum. And there are a few parties which are small but stable, like 50 Plus and the SGP, and a few parties which may or may not get a seat. Bay 1, Ja 21, Volt, etc. I mean, we're very close to election, so it's not so difficult anymore to make some kind of predictions about what's going to happen. I think I would be very surprised if that broad story was still upset. The VVD might get a couple less seats than they're expecting. One of the 6 parties might do a little bit better than they're expecting. Right, things can still climb a bit, but that distribution between the biggest, the 6 which follow, the 3 which follow, and those who may or may not get a seat, that I think we can be pretty confident about. Also because there's not a lot of like complicated electoral machinery, right? Some elections, in some elections, the calculation from what a result is to how the seats work is quite complicated. The Germans have a wonderfully complicated system. In the Netherlands, that's just not the case. So if a polling margin is off by 2, that means that a party might get 2% less seats, not that they might get half as many seats, right? Because they're just on the threshold of some important number. So yeah, that's going to be the case. That means that we can expect Rutte to form a new cabinet, barring massive surprises. I think it's rather likely that he forms a cabinet with the same parties if he's able to. I think Labour took a big sting from their participation in Rutte 2, in the second Liberal government under Rutte. I think that Rutte took quite a credibility hit himself and has had a decent falling out with some people due to this kind of supply and demand agreement that he had at some point with the far right. So that's likely not to reproduce itself. Yeah. So largely, my prediction is largely more of the same. Nothing very surprising.
Okay, I guess that makes a lot of sense. I would like to give the floor to Bas now to shortly talk about our other events that SIB is organizing soon, and then we'll run up.
Yes, so thanks so much to both the speakers and also Lisa for giving these very nice and very interesting presentations. There are a lot more events coming up organized by SIB also regarding the Dutch elections. So unrelated is the next event, which is on the 10th of March, which will be a board interest session. As Willem also talked about, we're looking for new board members. So if you're interested in joining the SIB board, which is probably a lot of fun, then you can come to this interest session. Then on the 14th of March, there's a SIB walk and talk, which is kind of like our way of doing physical events where you pair up individual SIB members to each other, where they can walk about in a park in Amsterdam and get to know each other a little bit better. Then on the 17th of March, of course, that is the day of the Dutch elections. We will host a viewing party in the evening, and the day after we will talk about the results of the Dutch elections among the SIB members and have interesting discussions about this as well. And then the 28th of March, there will be a treasure hunt throughout Amsterdam organized by the Committee of Social Activities. That being said, we will also send out a little questionnaire to all the participants to this event to gather some feedback so we know what to improve for our next events. But in any case, speaking for myself, but I think also on behalf of a lot of people that attended this event, it was super interesting. I learned a lot. I had no clue about demographics in the Netherlands and how this influenced the political spectrum, but also what kind of affects the diversification of the Dutch parliament would have on the future as well. So I would like to both thank you, Tom Teuns and also Marcel Libers, for giving these amazing insights. And also to our wonderful host, Lisa, thank you so much as well. I hope to see you at one of these future SIB events. For now, have a very nice evening. And I want to say goodbye. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all, Bas, to our great speakers, and to everyone that attended this event. We hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you all a nice evening too, and hopefully we'll see you at one of our other events. For the speakers, if you have time, we would like to invite you to stay behind for like a short after talk with the whole committee. Guess almost everyone has left. A few people still.
Yeah, I think this might also be a good time to stop the recording.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for reminding me.
We don't have to. Yeah. First of all, a big group thank you to both of you again. It was really a very interesting talk and engaging. And we also want to hear from you if you what you liked and maybe disliked about this event, what you think could be an improvement.